Everyone in the Ashford Hotel's private banquet hall stopped breathing the moment Ottoline Kane's pearl-handled compact slipped from the table and skidded across the polished marble floor. It landed at Mabel Austin's feet. Mabel was not supposed to be there. She was an accountant. Her world lived inside spreadsheets and reconciliation reports. Not the gilded banquet rooms where the city's most dangerous families hosted their quarterly dinners. But the event coordinator had called in sick at noon, and Mabel had volunteered, or more precisely, she had failed to look away fast enough when her supervisor swept the room for someone to cover. Now, she stood holding a tray of water glasses, feeling approximately as conspicuous as a fire alarm in a library, while Ottoline Kane fixed her with a gaze that had reportedly disassembled stronger people than Mabel Austin. The compact sat between them, 6 feet of marble and silence. Barclay, the hotel's general manager, appeared at Mabel's elbow with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for a catastrophe all evening. "Leave it," he murmured through his teeth. "Do not touch anything. Do not say anything." Mabel looked at the compact. She looked at Ottoline. The older woman had not moved, had not spoken. Her back was perfectly straight, her silver-threaded hair pinned at the nape of her neck, and her expression revealed absolutely nothing. But her right hand had dropped to the armrest in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. Mabel thought, like someone catching themselves after a moment of embarrassment. Mabel set down her tray. She crossed the 6 feet. She crouched beside the head table, picked up the compact, and placed it on the white linen in front of Ottoline Kane. "I think this is yours," she said. She did not apologize. She did not announce it. She simply put the thing back where it belonged and straightened up. Ottoline looked down at the compact. Then she looked at Mabel. Nobody in the room moved. The Kane family's private dinners at the Ashford had been a fixture for 11 years. In that time, a sous chef had quit rather than plate a dish that displeased Ottoline Kane. A department manager had been transferred to another property after forgetting Mrs. Kane's preference for still water. The hotel's senior staff maintained a running document, password-protected, 3 pages long, cataloguing every known preference, aversion, and sensitivity of the family's matriarch. They called it the Kane Protocol. Barclay had written it himself. Now Mabel Austin, who handled accounts payable on the 4th floor, and had never attended a single Kane event before tonight, had walked directly up to the woman without invitation and handled her personal belongings. Barclay's face had gone the color of old chalk. Ottoline's eyes, pale grey, sharp enough to part clouds, did not leave Mabel's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was exactly what everyone expected. Low, unhurried, impossible to ignore. "What is your name?" "Mabel Austin, Mrs. Kane. I'm with accounting." Accounting, a pause, not events. "No, ma'am. Tonight was a last-minute arrangement." "And you thought you should pick up my compact?" Mabel hesitated for exactly 1 second. Long enough, to be honest. "I thought you might have dropped it accidentally, and that it might have mattered to you." Another silence, longer this time. Ottoline turned it over in her fingers, the compact, gold-edged, the kind of thing that didn't come from a department store. "It was my mother's," she said. Then, as if she hadn't said it at all, "You may return to your tray, Miss Austin." Mabel nodded and went back to work. It took the room approximately 90 seconds to remember how to breathe. Barclay found her in the service corridor 20 minutes later. His voice was controlled, which was worse than shouting. "Do you understand what you did in there?" "I picked up something," she dropped. "You approached Ottoline Kane without authorization. You touched her personal property. You spoke to her without being addressed first." She didn't seem upset. She never seems upset. That's what makes her terrifying. He stopped walking, turned to face her. "If she decides tonight was an insult, this hotel suffers. Not you. This hotel, everyone in it. Mabel understood. She also understood that the compact reminded her of the small ceramic dish her grandmother had kept on her nightstand, the one that had held nothing more than a single ring, but that her mother had wrapped in 3 layers of tissue paper when they cleared the house. The kind of object that is irreplaceable, not because of its cost, but because of who touched it last. She recognized that moment of quiet loss on Ottoline Kane's face before anyone else in the room had thought to look. She didn't say any of that to Barclay. She said, "I'll be more careful," and went back to the corridor. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ottoline Kane, at that moment, was doing something she almost never did. She was thinking about a stranger. The dinner continued without incident. Mabel moved through it with the same measured efficiency she brought to everything. No wasted steps, no unnecessary conversation, eyes tracking a half-second ahead of what was needed. She refilled a water glass before anyone asked. She noticed when one of the senior Kane associates had pushed his chair back slightly. The angle suggested a bad back, and quietly brought a cushioned support without comment or fanfare. She was not performing. That was simply how she moved through the world. Quietly, usefully, trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. She had always been aware of her size in rooms like this. The service uniforms were designed for a different body. The sightlines of important guests tended to skip over her, land on someone more decorative. She had learned, over years, that invisibility had its own efficiency. You could get considerably more done when no one was watching. Ottoline Kane, apparently, was watching. When the dessert service concluded and guests began drifting toward the private lounge, Mabel was collecting linen napkins near the side credenza when footsteps stopped behind her. She turned. Ottoline stood alone, which was unusual. Her family was still visible through the doorway, voices low, the kind of conversation that didn't require her presence. "You noticed his back," Ottoline said. "I'm sorry." "My brother-in-law, the cushion." A slight incline of her head. "He's had 2 surgeries. He never asks for help." He seemed uncomfortable. He was. He wouldn't have said so. She studied Mabel. "You saw that from across the room." "I notice things." Mabel paused. "Sometimes too much, I think. Or not enough people notice at all." It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more like an observation, delivered with the same precision Ottoline applied to everything. But something in it settled warmly in Mabel's chest, and she held on to it quietly for the rest of the night. "Thank you for returning the compact," Ottoline said, "and for how you returned it." She walked back into the lounge before Mabel could respond. The story spread through the hotel staff by 9 the following morning. By 11, it had taken on a life entirely its own. She practically held Mrs. Kane's hand. She said something, and Ottoline actually smiled. I heard Mrs. Kane asked for her by name. Mabel corrected none of it. Corrections would have required participating in the conversation, and she had learned that participating in conversations about herself rarely improved anything. What she hadn't counted on was Cecile Rand. Cecile had worked in hotel operations for 6 years. 3 of them spent maneuvering for an event coordinator position that had gone, 6 months ago, to someone younger and, in Cecile's telling of it, far less deserving. She was efficient, perfectly professional in front of guests, and entirely devoted to the idea that recognition was a finite resource, which meant someone else's share came directly from her own. She started her campaign subtly, the way competent people always do. "I just think it's interesting," she said to 2 banquet staff folding cocktail napkins in the prep room. "Mabel has never worked a Kane dinner before. She's an accountant, and the one time she shows up, she does exactly the thing that gets noticed." A small pause. She'd already positioned herself near the head table, which, I'm just saying, is the one spot where Mrs. Kane always sits. Neither of the banquet staff replied. They didn't have to. The implication had already taken root. By Thursday, Mabel noticed the small changes. The prep room quieted when she entered. A standing invitation to the Friday lunch run simply stopped appearing in her messages. A colleague she had always liked found reasons to end conversations before they properly started. She knew what was happening. She had seen it before, aimed at other people, in other places. The particular loneliness of being accused of wanting something you hadn't known you had. She went back to her spreadsheets. She did her work. She thanked the housekeeping staff by name when they cleared the service corridors, the same as she always had. She brought coffee to the loading dock supervisor on cold mornings, because he was there before the catering cart arrived. And she passed that way anyway. She was not going to become a smaller version of herself, because someone needed her to. Ambrose Kane arrived on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the dinner. He had not been present that night. A meeting in Geneva had run past midnight, and he had learned of his mother's altered mood only through a brief call she made from the car home. His mother never made unnecessary calls. The fact that she had made one specifically to describe, in measured terms, a hotel accountant who had returned her compact with a great deal of dignity had occupied a corner of his mind ever since. He came to the hotel under the pretense of reviewing the quarterly billing. This was legitimate. He reviewed all major event invoices personally. What was less legitimate was his insistence on reviewing them in person, in an office on the property, rather than having them sent to his CFO the way he did every other time. Barclay met him with the nervous energy of a man bracing for bad weather. "Mr. Kane, an honor as always." "The invoice," Ambrose said. He was 42 years old, built for rooms like this. Straight posture, quiet voice, the kind of face that gave nothing away. His suits cost more than most people's car payments. His name in this city produced the same reflexive caution as the sight of dark clouds on a clear afternoon. Barclay produced the invoice. Ambrose took it and said, without looking up, "I'd also like to speak with one of your accounting staff, a Mabel Austin." Barclay's expression flickered through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. "Of course. I'll have her brought up." "No," he set down the invoice. "I'll go to her." Mabel's office was, by any objective measure, not a place where people like Ambrose Kane went. It was a 4th-floor interior room with no windows, a desk that had survived 2 building renovations, and a corkboard covered in color-coded flags for reconciliation deadlines. She had a small potted succulent on the corner of her desk that she watered every Monday, regardless of how Monday was going, because constancy, her mother had always said, was its own kind of discipline. She did not look up immediately when the knock came. She was mid-formula, and losing her place would cost her 4 minutes. "1 second," she said. She finished the formula. She saved the file. She looked up. Ambrose Kane was standing in her doorway. She recognized him from the hotel's internal Kane protocol document, which she had never officially been sent, but which had been left open on the shared drive by someone careless. His photo was 9 years old and still accurate. Mabel stood, not out of intimidation, out of manners. "Mr. Kane, can I help you?" He stepped inside, taking in the room with the practiced discretion of someone who assessed spaces without appearing to. "You're the one who returned my mother's compact." "I am." "She described you as the woman who notices things." Mabel almost smiled. "That's a generous interpretation." He sat, uninvited, in the single guest chair across from her desk. She sat back down. Neither of them made it strange. "I'd like to understand the invoice discrepancy on line 47, he said, sliding the document across the desk. Mabel looked at line 47. There was no discrepancy on line 47. It was a perfectly ordinary floral charge. She looked up at him. He met her eyes. Something in his expression was almost, not quite, wry. The florist upsized the centerpieces 8 inches without prior authorization, she said, which was true and which she had already flagged in an internal memo. I've requested a partial credit. You should receive confirmation by end of week. Good. He didn't move. Was there something else? She asked. My mother wants to invite you to lunch. Mabel looked at him steadily. She doesn't explain her reasons, he continued. She never does. But she's mentioned you twice in 1 week, which I can tell you is unusual. He paused. She'd like to know if you're willing. Mabel looked at the succulent. She looked at the corkboard. She thought about Cecile Rand's carefully casual implications, about Barclay's chalk-pale face, about the specific weight of being noticed by people who almost never noticed anyone. Why would I decline? She said. Ambrose looked at her for a moment. Most people would find a reason. I'm not most people, she said. Not proudly, just accurately. He rose. Friday, noon, the hotel restaurant, lower level. He paused at the door. She'll be there at 11:58. She's always early. I'll be there at 11:55, Mabel said. He walked out. Mabel sat in her windowless office with the succulent and the corkboard and thought about what, exactly, had just happened. Then she went back to the spreadsheet. The formula still needed finishing. The lunch was nothing like what the hotel staff imagined it would be. Ottoline arrived at 11:58. She found Mabel already seated, a glass of still water in front of her, menu closed. Ottoline sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, which Mabel recognized as an assessment and did not try to fill with noise. You came early, Ottoline said. You strike me as someone who prefers punctuality. I don't recall mentioning that. You didn't. I inferred it. Mabel kept her tone easy. The way you checked your watch during the dinner service, twice before the second course. The timeline had slipped 4 minutes. I adjusted the third course. The older woman considered that. You adjusted the course timing. I was covering for events. It was my job to catch it. But you caught it for me specifically, not for the kitchen. Mabel met her gaze. Does it matter which reason, if the result was the same? Something softened in Ottoline's expression, not dramatically, not in a way anyone across the restaurant could have identified. But Mabel was close enough to see it, the small, careful softening of someone who had held themselves rigid for a very long time. It matters, Ottoline said quietly, more than you might think. They talked through the meal. Mabel told her about accounts, how hotels of this size moved money in patterns that could be read like weather, how she had originally trained for forensic accounting before deciding that a life built inside evidence of wrongdoing was not the kind of life she wanted. Ottoline listened the way very few people did, not waiting for a gap, but actually absorbing. She told Mabel about the compact. Her mother, who had died 2 years before Ottoline married. The compact had sat at the bottom of a jewelry box for 40 years before Ottoline had started carrying it, and she could not explain why she had started, only that some mornings it felt like a necessary thing. Mabel listened without performing sympathy. She asked a single question. What was her name? Ottoline looked at her. Rosabelle. That's a beautiful name, Mabel said, simply, without elaboration. Ottoline looked away for a moment, toward the restaurant's tall windows, and the street beyond them. Ambrose's father used to say that everyone knows what they deserve, she said, but very few people know what they need. She turned back. I think you might be one of the few. It was Ambrose who first noticed the change in his mother. He had spent 20 years reading her. Not her words, which were always precise chosen, but the space between them. Since his father's death, she had carried something heavier than grief, the kind of weight that settles in when trust becomes too expensive to extend. She was lighter after the lunch, not dramatically. But when she called him that evening, she mentioned Mabel's name without prompting, which was something she had not done with anyone's name in recent memory. 2 weeks after the lunch, on a Tuesday evening, he parked 3 blocks from the hotel. He told himself he was checking on a property matter. Through the tall windows of the hotel lobby, he watched Mabel cross the ground floor toward the service corridor, carrying a box of files. A young front desk attendant was struggling with a luggage cart that had locked wheels, and without stopping, without making it into a moment, Mabel set down her files, fixed the wheel, said something that made the attendant laugh, and continued walking. No one thanked her. She hadn't waited for it. Later, she sat in the lower restaurant on her break, sharing her table with one of the prep cooks who was eating alone. She didn't make conversation. She just didn't take the empty table 4 feet away. She let the cook have the company of another person without the obligation of performing it. Ambrose stood outside in the November cold for longer than made sense. He was not a man who was easily affected by people. His world had trained him otherwise. He had learned early that warmth, when deployed strategically, was just another instrument of control. He knew every variation of it. He had used most of them himself. Mabel Austin did not appear to be deploying anything. She was simply existing. Fully, without apology, without the particular vigilance of someone hoping to be seen. He drove home and called no one, which was unusual for him, and thought about her the entire way. The invitation arrived on Mabel's desk on a Wednesday morning. Handwritten, on cream-white personal stationery, a small O monogrammed at the top. Miss Austin. I am told our hotel's hospitality program lacks a coherent structure for how guests are welcomed during extended stays. I suspect you would have opinions about this. I would like to hear them. If you are willing, I would welcome your involvement as a consulting advisor to the Kane Foundation's Guest Services Initiative. This is a paid arrangement, conducted on whatever schedule does not interfere with your current position. I find myself curious what else you notice that the rest of us miss. Oh, Kane. Mabel read it twice. She set it beside the succulent. She thought about Cecile Rand's voice in the prep room. She thought about Barclay's face. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. The interpretations people would attach to a plus-size hotel accountant who received a handwritten note from Ottiline Kane. She wrote back the same afternoon, I'm available Thursdays. I'll prepare notes in advance. The initiative met in a foundation conference room overlooking the botanical garden. Ottiline did not appear to do things by accident, and Mabel suspected the view had been chosen the way everything about Ottiline was chosen, deliberately, with the full weight of its effect considered in advance. Ambrose was there the first day. He had questions about the service model budget, he said. Mabel caught the slight shift in Ottiline's expression, a very small private satisfaction. She filed it away without comment. They worked across the table from each other, with a professional ease that surprised her. He asked blunt questions and listened without interrupting. She gave direct answers and didn't pad them. When they disagreed, about prioritization, about outreach structure, neither performed the disagreement or tried to smooth it away. They argued cleanly and moved on. Ottiline, at the head of the table, watched them both. Months passed. The initiative expanded. Mabel found herself in the foundation offices, too. Then, 3 times a week, redesigning intake systems, retraining volunteer coordinators, building something that was starting to resemble what she had always privately wanted to do with her particular talent, for seeing what was needed before anyone said so. One evening, after everyone else had gone, she and Ambrose were carrying stacked chairs back to the storage room. It was unglamorous work. He said nothing about this. Your mother is going to want to expand to a second location, Mabel said, lifting a chair. She's already looking at properties. The east side makes more logistical sense than the north. I know. He stacked 2 chairs at once. I already told her. What did she say? She said she'd think about it. He glanced sideways. She'll pick the east side. Mabel smiled at the shelf. She was going to pick the east side regardless. She needed someone to confirm it first. Don't tell her that. I wouldn't dream of it. A comfortable silence settled. Not the kind that meant they had run out of things to say. The other kind. Can I ask you something? Ambrose said. You will regardless. A beat of something that on another man might have been amusement. Why did you pick up her compact? In that moment, not the reason you gave Barclay. Mabel looked at the shelf for a moment. She looked like she was trying not to show that it mattered to her, she said. That's a feeling I recognize. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. His expression had shifted into something she had not seen on him before. Not the careful blankness he carried in boardrooms, not the controlled patience he used in meetings. Something more direct, something that had decided not to hide itself. You've been underestimated, he said. Not a question. Regularly, she said it without bitterness, just fact. By people who should have known better. By people doing their best with limited vision. She shrugged one shoulder. It never felt like malice, just smallness. He looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, I don't have small vision. Mabel held his gaze. I know, she said. I noticed. The Kane Foundation's annual gala was held in April, in the ballroom of a restored concert hall that Ottoline had loved since she was 23. Mabel arrived early, as she always did now, and set up the volunteer check-in table herself, rearranging the name badges into alphabetical order, because whoever had arranged them first had done them by arrival time, which made no sense, and she was constitutionally incapable of walking past something that made no sense. Ambrose found her there at 6:43, 17 minutes before the doors opened. You don't have to do that, he said. Someone has to. There are people hired for that. They set them up by arrival time. She handed him a name badge without looking up. Yours is under C. He took it. He did not point out that he obviously knew his own last name. He just pinned it on. They worked the room together when the guests arrived. Not as a couple, not announced. Simply two people who happened to share the same instinct, about which Donor needed rescuing from a bad conversation, where the drinks table had created a bottleneck when an elderly guest had been standing slightly too long without a chair. Ottoline watched from across the ballroom. She had attended events like this one for 30 years. She had grown accustomed to the performance of generosity. The large checks, the photographed handshakes, the careful choreography of people who wanted to be seen, wanting to help. She was not cynical about it. Performance was not nothing, but it was not everything. What she was watching now was different. Ambrose, who had not laughed easily in years, said something near the bar that made Mabel press her fingers to her mouth to contain it, and then stop trying and laugh openly, warm and unguarded, in a way Ottoline had not seen from her son since before his father died. And Mabel, who had spent years making herself small in rooms that did not accommodate her size or her particular kind of intelligence, was standing perfectly upright in a dark green dress, giving a Foundation volunteer her complete and unhurried attention. Tap, sir. As though there were nowhere else in its world she was supposed to be. When the Master of Ceremonies called Ottoline to the stage, she went up, and she thanked the donors, and she spoke about the work. Then she said something she had not prepared, which was unusual for her, because she prepared everything. A year ago, she said, I dropped something at dinner, and a woman I had never met picked it up without making it a moment, without first deciding whether I was important enough to warrant the gesture. She paused. I have spent a great deal of my life surrounded by people who were skilled at calculating who deserved what. I have not always been an exception to that habit myself. The ballroom was very quiet. What I've learned this year is that the people who never calculate deserve, who simply offer, are the people who make everything else possible. She found Mabel in the crowd. I am more grateful than I know how to properly say. Mabel stood very still. Her eyes were bright. She did not look away. After, when the applause had settled and donors had begun moving toward the exits, Ambrose appeared at her side. "She doesn't do that," he said. "Talk about people, not like that in public." "I know. She means it." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the particular voice he used when he had decided something and was simply stating it, "I'm glad you picked it up." Mabel looked up at him. In the warm light of the old concert hall, with the sound of the last guests filtering out and volunteers beginning to stack chairs. Real chairs, which she would help with in a moment, she thought about the fourth-floor office. The spreadsheet she had refused to abandon mid-formula. The way she had said, "I'm not most people," without yet knowing how much she had meant it. "So am I," she said. He reached out and straightened the name badge still pinned to her lapel. It had gone crooked sometime in the past 3 hours. His hand stayed there a moment longer than the task required. Neither of them stepped back. Ottiline Kane, watching from across the room, set down her champagne glass and allowed herself, privately, the smallest possible smile. She had spent a lifetime learning to distinguish between people who wanted something from her family and people who simply wanted to exist in the world alongside them as equals. Without calculation, without the particular deference that wealth tended to manufacture in everyone it touched. She had not expected to find that distinction in an accounting office on the 4th floor of her family's hotel. But then, she had also not expected to drop her mother's compact in front of a stranger. And look, she thought, at where that had led.